So I'm going to take a number of things as read, and one of them is one of the points that Ian made when he was quoting Barack Obama about if you could choose any time in history to live, you'd probably choose right now. And I would say that as a woman living and working, I would definitely choose this century, not previous ones. But I don't take those equality or other gains like commitment to academic freedom for granted, because one of the other things I think we can take as read is that national and global space is contested pretty much everywhere in the world except where it's suppressed. I think that globalization and social media have seen to that. Now, of course, there are very important local differences in how that manifests itself, and in Britain right now, it's manifesting itself in Brexit. You could say that we are making a bit of a hash of addressing what some academics call the Globalization Trilemma. So Harvard's Danny Roderick, in a lecture, which I think was 4 years ago in Oxford, he was referring to his work on the Globalization Trilemma, and he argued that you can only have 2 out of 3 of the following. It's like one of those ghastly games where you're asked to choose when actually you want everything. And I'm not going to talk about cake here until later. But he said you can only have 2 of the following 3 things: democracy, hyper-globalization, and national sovereignty. And he predicted, now remember, this is 2013, that some European countries might opt for democracy and national sovereignty above cross-border integration. Now, Danny Roderick had in mind the southern European countries who were suffering from high unemployment as a result, he argued, and I think he was right, of incomplete banking, fiscal and political union across the Eurozone. We haven't had that, or we haven't had it yet. Instead, we got Brexit. Think about those 3 things. So that's how I would briefly characterize the contested space, and that's the space that university leaders, like other leaders, have to operate in. If Nelson Mandela, most of my heroes are South African, I'm not going to apologize for that, but if Nelson Mandela was right, and I really strongly believe that he was, education is the most powerful weapon which you can use to change the world. So what should education leaders do for the best in the current contested context? And I'm just going to argue that they should do 2 things, 2 big things. The first, and I think this is a big revival that's required, is reviving that shared understanding of the public as well as the private value. And I don't just mean the private economic value of a university education. And that has to be based on reinforcing what's essentially a cultural belief in the intrinsic value of education and research, why education is important, and an understanding that education really isn't about teaching students what to think about capitalism or free trade or globalization or democracy or whatever, but how to think intelligently for themselves about those things. The second big thing I think university leaders need to do is to cultivate what the Vice-Chancellor of Wits University in South Africa, Adam Habib, calls equal partnerships in an unequal world. Ian touched on this, but I think this is very much about spanning some of the differences between the so-called North and the so-called Global South. The first of those 2 big things is difficult because it goes against current trends. The emphasis these days is very much on what a university education can do for you, not what it can do for your country. I encountered anti-intellectualism in South Africa, but I didn't expect people in this country have had enough of experts, from Michael Gove here in the UK. Trump's tweets, astonishingly, to my mind, didn't prevent him getting elected, nor did Boris Johnson's larky pro-cake and pro-eating-it approach to Brexit stop him getting re-elected. I think that championing the public value of education and teaching students how to think these days, right now, bumps up against some pretty deeply rooted political stereotypes. I can't track down, I'd be delighted if anybody can tell me afterwards over coffee, which MP asked, rhetorically of course, which Vice-Chancellor Why on earth would I want a university in my constituency? Then they'd only vote Labour. I can also think of several developing countries and emerging economies, I'm not going to name them, I used to be a diplomat, but where vested interests block autonomy or adequate funding of universities, or both. I believe that societies need academics from across the political spectrum, both for intellectual challenge and to counter politically motivated anti-intellectualism. Which brings me to my second optimal strategic response in the very contested context which university leaders are operating in, and that's the one eloquently summed up by Adam Habib. At UCL, we talk about global partnerships of equivalence. Ian talked about a generosity of spirit. These are right at the heart of UCL's global engagement strategy. They're really hard to create, partly for the same reason that all meaningful relationships are hard. You have to find the right one or ones for you. You have to work at them. And they take considerable time and intellectual and emotional effort to maintain, not least because they entail confronting history not written by the so-called winners, something else that politicians aren't wild about doing. But the creation and the sharing of knowledge, which is what universities are fundamentally about, is, I would say, quintessentially international. We have to learn to walk in other people's shoes. We have to learn from the paths they've traveled and where they're heading to help understand our own path. And this, by the way, is not an alternative to what Ian was talking about in terms of civic or regional or local connectedness. I think it's more a question of degree. Some universities will choose to identify as more local or more global, but frankly, the local is pretty global these days in any case. All good strategies and optimal strategic responses address the why and the how as well as the what. Political leaders ought to look to universities to help them keep up with or even ahead of global trends and challenges. And university leaders need to explain why they are just the people to do that. And investing in international partnerships of mutual trust and respect is a really good way of identifying how to spot the trends, the challenges, and the solutions. Because, and this is very similar to the point that Ian was making about the alliances the UNSW is involved in, no single institution or country, however powerful or prestigious, can find fair solutions to global challenges on their own. And I'm going to finish with my favorite African proverb, which is that if you want to walk fast, walk alone. If you want to walk far, walk together. Thank you.